there's this story about a man who thought that he could take it with him. We, of course, all know that you can't. But he had this idea that if he packed up his belongings that he really wanted, and he put them in a suitcase in the attic, that as he was going up to heaven, he would grab it on his way up. So, eventually, of course, the man did die. And a few weeks later, his wife was cleaning out and went up into the attic and saw this suitcase up there. She looked at it and just shook her head. She says, "The fool, he should have put it in the basement." Jesus tells us that we need to rejoice because our names are written in heaven. But that being said, when our choices have an effect on whether they're written in heaven or whether they're not, and we might have to go through the basement, so to speak. The gift of God is that He wants us to be part of His life. And He's given us freedom. And this weekend, as we celebrate Independence Day, the freedom for our country, we recognize this gift of freedom in a special way. But the gift of freedom that God gives us is not just a gift of freedom from, for instance, tyranny, oppressive government, but rather it's freedom for. Freedom for something. And what is this freedom for? It's freedom for God. Freedom for love. Freedom for truth and goodness. That God has given us our free choice, not so that we can do whatever we want, whenever we want to, in whatever way we want to, with whomever we want to. That ends up actually being a formula for slavery, which I'll talk about in a minute. But rather, this gift of freedom was given to us because God so longs to be our lover. But love must be free. Love can never be forced. And so we have to have the opportunity to say no, so that our yes means something. Our yes means nothing if we can't say no. We'll return to that later. When we look at this gift of freedom, we see that this gift of freedom is given to us and it affects everything we do. Every choice we make is ultimately either a choice for God or not God, whether it's of overt or not. And the thing is, we think that, well, we're free so we can go and choose to do whatever we want. When I was in college, you remember that good Catholic college I went to, University of New Hampshire? When I went to college, one of my friends who lived on my floor came up to me and we were talking about stuff and she says, "God gave me freedom to be able to do whatever I want, and I'm going to go and do it." And there was something in the back of my head, even in the front of my head, saying, there's something just not right about what she's saying there. I didn't know how to explain what was wrong, but ultimately what it comes down to is, the truth is, we can choose to do anything we want, but we can't choose the consequences from those actions. We can choose to do anything we want, but we can't choose the consequences. And this is the truth. Because when we then look at our freedom, we have to say, do we want to or not? For instance, when I was really young, 20, I thought it would be a good idea to stick a fork into an outlet. No. I was much younger. But you look at that and you say, okay, if I put a fork into an outlet, that's a choice I can make. But I don't choose the consequence that goes along with that. And I learned at a very young age, that's not a good thing to do. Just saying. If you decide that you want to dry out your silverware in the microwave, you're going to learn very quickly, not a good thing to do. We can choose to do it, but we can't choose the consequences. And the thing is, when we look at our choices in our lives, they have both natural and supernatural consequences. And so our actions then have eternal weight. So when we look at the way we choose to act, some things we do, like for instance, if we were to do the corporal works of mercy, feeding the sick, giving drink to feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, visiting the sick at the imprisoned, those things. If we were to do the works of mercy, that has eternal weight. Then again, if we choose to go for that third helping of dessert, not only does that have natural weight, but it also has eternal weight, supernatural weight. What does that do? Well, we've chosen not to work on our discipline. We've chosen to go the way of gluttony. And that has an effect on our souls. Has an effect on our souls. So these are the choices of our way of acting, but also our way of talking. Because we can choose, like St. Paul says in Ephesians, he says, say only the things people need to hear to build them up. And we can choose to build people up by our words. But we can also choose to tear them down. We can choose to speak truth, or we can choose to speak lies. We can choose to spread gossip, or we can choose at times to keep our mouths shut. And those have an effect on the world around us and on ourselves. There's also a choice of how we think. Now, I'm not talking about any random thought that comes into our minds. We can't control that necessarily, but we can control what we choose to do with them, how we choose to react to those thoughts, whether we choose to hold on to them, to let them grow, or get rid of them, depending on whether they're good or whether they're bad, depends on what we do with it. And so we might, for instance, be hurt by someone, and so we choose to hold on to that hurt and let it grow into anger, and choose to let it then flourish in resentment and bitterness. And it destroys us. Or we can choose to forgive, to let it go, to hand it over into the hands of God. Our choices of how we act, how we speak, how we think, have both natural and supernatural consequences. We hear in the gospel today, Jesus talks about how if they don't accept you, if they don't receive you, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom on that day than for that town. It has an effect on whether our names are written in heaven. Now, thanks be to God, we have a merciful God. Now, I mentioned earlier that our choice to be able to do whatever we want to do, whenever we want to do it, in whatever way we want to do it, with whomever we want to do it, ends up not being a formula for freedom, but rather for slavery. What does that look like? So if I chose to go on a diet, I find, that I'm not as free as I thought I was. Because my addiction to food holds me enslaved. Speaking to different people who are alcoholics, they freely chose that first drink. They freely chose to get drunk the first time. But now in the throes of addiction, they're no longer free. And if you ask them sometimes, do you want to have a drink? They'd say yes. But their yes means nothing if they can't say no. If they can't say no, it means they're not free. And so often that's the way that doing whatever we want, whenever we want, with whomever we want, in whatever way we want, ends up being where we end up in addiction, in slavery. But thanks be to God for Jesus Christ our Lord, because He has come to set us free. And then He can break us free from these chains. And so we can have what true freedom is: to follow God, to choose the good, to love. So we can choose. We make choices about what we do, but we don't choose the consequences. It means we have to examine and say, what are the consequences in our lives? What will bring me true freedom? What will help me to have my name written in heaven as a consequence of my action, my word, my thought, as opposed to what will have my name not written in heaven? This day, may we beg God for that grace to grow in the freedom which Christ has won for us.